Chapter 16, The Crimson Courtyard. Once you get through the battlefield, and once you get through the maze, you reach the gate. And that's where the real test begins. Because up until now, you've been assessed by systems, by instinct, by reaction, by architecture designed to keep the wrong people out without ever needing to explain why. But the moment you reach the gate, you are no longer background noise. This is where the Crimson Courtyard finally turns its head. Before this, you were a variable, a possibility, a curiosity moving through filters. Here you are noticed, not welcomed, not trusted, not invited, not yet. The Crimson Courtyard is not a place of warmth. It is not kind. It is not sentimental. It is a place of judgment, but not in the way people expect. This is not about morality. This is not about right or wrong. This is not even about intent. This is about impact. Every word you spoke in the maze echoes here. Every step you took on the battlefield is visible from above. Every reaction, hesitation, escalation, retreat, all of it is laid bare on crimson stone. The floor is red not for drama, but for memory. This is where things are processed properly. The courtyard is where logic and emotion sit opposite one another and are forced to coexist, where empathy argues with self-preservation, where loyalty debates caution, where curiosity is weighed against consequence. Nothing is hidden here. Nothing can perform. Masks don't work in the Crimson Courtyard. False confidence collapses. Manipulation dies quickly. And the important thing to understand is this: Danny is not consciously running this process. Externally, he is living, talking, moving, reacting. Internally, this court is already in session. The prosecution and the defense are not asking who you say you are. They are asking what happens when you are near. Do things stabilize? Do they escalate? Do patterns repeat? Do alarms trigger? The Crimson Courtyard doesn't care how charming you are. It doesn't care how long you've known him. It doesn't care how badly you want access. It cares about what you cost. Because this is the last place before the tower. And the tower is not a place you are allowed to damage. Those who make it this far are no longer dismissed lightly, but they are also not given mercy by default. This is the point where a decision is made, often long before Danny ever realizes one has been reached. Some are allowed to pass through the gate, some are redirected back into the maze, some are quietly, permanently filtered out, and a very small number are granted something else entirely: a position, not a room, not access, a role. Because once the Crimson Courtyard acknowledges you, you are no longer just someone moving towards the fortress. You are someone the system must now account for, and that changes everything. And even while all of this is happening, Danny himself may be running on autopilot. Externally, he's living his life, working, talking, moving forward, responding, unaware that beneath the surface, the Crimson Courtyard is already in session. But when Danny is present, when he slows down enough, reflects enough, becomes that character consciously, he can return here himself. He can step into the courtyard. He can face the bench. He can look around at every voice, every faction, every argument, and ask the only question that ever really matters: what the fuck is going on? And he will always be given the same answer, the same reasoning, the same justification, that there is nothing to undo, nothing to rewind, nothing to argue away, because the system has already run its course. Yes, in theory, the judge could overrule it. Danny could just do what he wants anyway. But that's when the uproar begins. That's when the Crimson Courtyard stops being a quiet process and becomes a full-blown parliament. That's when voices start shouting over each other. That's when logic fights emotion, instinct fights desire, and every internal faction drags Danny in a different direction at once. That's when it becomes chaos. That's when it becomes exhausting. That's when it becomes a head fuck. Because the truth is this: the system isn't built by Danny as much as it is built for Danny. It exists to stop him tearing himself apart, to stop impulse overriding consequence, to stop him sacrificing long-term sanity for short-term relief. This isn't about control, it's about survival engineering. The Crimson Courtyard doesn't exist to serve Danny's wants. It exists to protect him from them. And that's why, no matter how much he argues with it, no matter how much he protests, no matter how much he wants to take a shortcut, the answer is always the same. It is what it is. Subconsciously, the Crimson Courtyard is not reacting, it is adjudicating. Every decision made here is built from accumulation, not impulse. Fact, pattern, evidence, observation. What was seen on the battlefield, not just who struck first, but how you fought, what you protected, what you destroyed, and whether the violence was necessary or indulgent. What was felt in the maze, not just what you said, but how you said it, what you avoided, what you mirrored, what dissonated. The courtyard sees all of it, not emotionally, not sentimentally, but clinically. The judge, the sun, has already watched the external world play out. The court has already reviewed the walk through conflict, the tone of conversation, the reactions to pressure, the rhythm of your presence. So when you finally reach the gate, you're not being assessed for potential. You're being assessed for consistency. This is why some people are laughed out with humor. This is why some are buried under jargon so dense it feels absurd. This is why others are quietly shown the door without explanation at all. From the outside, it can look ridiculous, like Danny is listening to voices in his head, like decisions are being made for reasons no one else can see. But those voices aren't working against him. They're working for him. They are carrying everything Danny doesn't consciously track: micro-reactions, tonal shifts, repeated patterns, subtle misalignments, the things most people ignore or miss entirely. All of it is logged. All of it is weighed. And Danny doesn't refuse to overrule the court out of fear. He doesn't overrule it because when the decision is eventually presented back to him, after reflection, after time, after distance, it makes sense. That clarity doesn't arrive instantly. It can take days, sometimes weeks. In the heat of the moment, if you asked him why, he wouldn't give you an answer. Not because he doesn't have one, but because it hasn't surfaced yet. What he's really saying when he says, I need to think about it, is, I need to go to the court. I need to see what's already been decided. I need to understand why. And sometimes it wasn't even a full court ruling. Sometimes the Crimson Courtyard delegates. Responsibility is handed to the appropriate faction: the War Council, the archivists, the guardians, the gatekeepers. A decision is made locally within the system without requiring full deliberation. And when Danny tries to consciously step into that role, to reflect, to review, to understand, it's rarely straightforward. He doesn't just walk into the courtyard because he owns it. He has to request access. He has to slow down. He has to be in the right state. And between intention and arrival, there are countless cobbled streets branching out in every direction, worn stone paths that split, rejoin, diverge, and disappear into places unseen. Distractions, conversations, memories, new information. He bumps into something. That becomes the focus. That redirects him. Reflection isn't a switch, it's a process. And the Crimson Courtyard will wait, patiently, immovably, until Danny is ready to hear what it has already decided. Because when the system moves, it doesn't do so lightly. It moves because it has already seen enough. This is the part where most people would stop, tilt their head, and say, what the fuck? Because this isn't metaphorical organization. This isn't poetic journaling. This is a full internal governance system built by a schizophrenic dragon Capricorn who got tired of being torn apart by impulse, contradiction, emotion, and aftermath. So he didn't suppress the voices. He cataloged them. He didn't argue with himself in a blur. He made them argue with each other in one place, under rules, in front of him. That place is the Crimson Courtyard. When you stand there, you don't hear one voice. You hear dozens, sometimes hundreds, all at once, all convinced they're right, all carrying their own emotional charge, their own memories, their own scars. And they are not abstract. They have posture, tone, volume, temperament. They take seats. On the left benches, you'll find the ones forged in threat, and there are far more of them than anyone expects. Fear sits forward, sharp-eyed, never blinking. Rage paces instead of sitting. Panic talks too fast and interrupts everyone. Jealousy leans in close, whispering poison like its strategy. Resentment keeps records, dates, names, slights. Bitterness smirks, arms folded, waiting to be proven right again. Suspicion doesn't speak much, but when it does, the room listens. But it doesn't stop there. Anxiety runs projections of worst-case scenarios that haven't happened yet. Hypervigilance never sits down, scanning every doorway, every tonal shift, every pause for threat. Insecurity feeds rage ammunition when pride feels threatened. Inferiority hisses comparisons. They're smarter, stronger, better than you, demanding retaliation before shame sets in. Envy sharpens resentment into something actionable. Jealousy reframes everything as loss prevention. Paranoia insists neutrality doesn't exist. Hatred doesn't shout, it waits patiently for permission. Hatred doesn't shout, it waits patiently for permission. Contempt scoffs at restraint. Disgust recoils, demanding eradication rather than tolerance. Shame flips instantly into aggression the moment it feels exposed. Guilt, twisted and misused, argues punishment is deserved, if not externally, then internally. Angst paces, convinced the world itself is hostile. Weltschmerz slumps in its seat, world weary, pushing for scorched earth just to feel something. Bitterness keeps the archive. Resentment keeps the receipts. Rage doesn't speak, it waits. These aren't bad emotions, they are adaptive weapons. They were born in moments where being gentle would have cost him something permanent. They don't care about fairness. They care about never being caught off guard again. This is dragon energy in its rawest form. Territorial, dominant, intolerant of disrespect. Add Capricorn to that, and you get structure applied to aggression. Not chaos, calculated hostility. Across the courtyard on the right benches sit the counterweight, not weaker, just quieter, the ones who remember why things mattered in the first place. Empathy is tired, but still shows up. Compassion speaks quietly and gets ignored too often. Hope keeps standing up, even after being knocked down repeatedly. Trust is cautious now, scarred but not dead. Acceptance watches everything before speaking. Self-compassion arrives late and leaves early. And behind them, more gather. Understanding tries to contextualize intent. Patience waits longer than most people would tolerate. Optimism is bruised but stubborn. Respect sits upright, insisting behavior matters more than status. Belonging argues for continuity rather than isolation. Gratitude brings perspective when rage narrows the lens. Relief reminds the room what peace actually feels like. Serenity rarely gets heard, but when she does, the room stills. Healthy confidence doesn't shout. Curiosity keeps asking why instead of how hard should we hit. Awe remembers that not everything is a threat. Some things are just vast. Belief sits quietly beside faith, not religious, but existential. There has to be more than constant war. These voices don't deny danger. They ask whether every danger deserves fire. Between the benches sit the fractured roles, never fully loyal to either side. Confidence sometimes sides with war. Logic switches allegiance mid-sentence. Pride gets offended and storms left. Guilt drifts right, dragging shame behind it. Curiosity leans forward, fascinated by the chaos. Disgust recoils from both sides. Nostalgia just wants everyone to stop fighting. And then there are the past selves. Versions of Danny from different ages, different losses, different betrayals. Each one frozen at the moment they learned a lesson the hard way. They don't speak often, but when they do, it's brutal. They are living exhibits. This is why it feels insane from the outside. Because yes, this man has taken every emotional reaction he has ever had, every instinct, every contradiction, and forced them into a courtroom to fight it out while he watches. And he does watch, not always consciously, but the system runs whether he's aware of it or not. When he is present, when he steps into that role, he isn't a judge in the moral sense. He's an arbiter of outcome, a sheriff, a final authority who doesn't care who shouted loudest, only whose argument survives scrutiny. This is dragon psychology. Power must be tested. Capricorn psychology. Power must be organized. So nothing acts alone. No emotion gets unchecked authority. No impulse goes unchallenged. No softness exists without defense. No aggression exists without consequence. When people say Danny overthinks, what they're really seeing is a multi-faction internal civil war being processed faster than most people can handle a single feeling. And here's the part that really fucks people up. He didn't build this to dominate others. He built it to contain himself. Because without this system, without this brutal internal democracy, the dragon doesn't just lash out. It burns indiscriminately. The Crimson Courtyard exists so the fire has walls. So when a decision finally lands, when Danny pulls away, cuts ties, stands ground, or lets someone in, it isn't random. It's the verdict of 100 voices, argued to exhaustion, under a sun that sees everything and a moon that remembers why it matters. And that's why when he tells you I've thought about it, what he really means is, you have already lost or passed an internal trial you never even knew you were standing in, and the ruling has already been made. Underneath all the drama, the shouting, the grand debates and verdicts, the Crimson Courtyard is also doing something far less theatrical and far more important. It runs everything. Not every decision calls a full assembly. Not every moment needs the benches filled, the past self summoned, the factions riled. Most of the time, the court isn't even noticed. Because alongside the arguments, alongside the philosophy and strategy, the system also carries the mundane machinery of survival. Breathing, blinking, hunger, thirst, fatigue. The need to stand up, stretch, piss, sleep. And threaded through that same background hum are the quieter, baser impulses, the ones that don't argue their case, they simply register. Desire, lust, appetite, greed, vanity, comfort-seeking, avoidance, indulgence. They don't take seats on the benches. They don't shout. They don't need permission. They drift through the courtyard like vendors passing through a market, noticed, logged, rarely challenged unless they start demanding more space than they're entitled to. Lust doesn't summon a debate. It signals. Greed doesn't argue. It reaches. Vanity doesn't speak. It preens, checks reflections, adjusts posture. These things are present because they are human, because they are animal, because they are unavoidable. The system doesn't moralize them. It contains them. The war council isn't convened because Danny wants comfort. The monks, shamans, witches, and priests don't descend from Omnist Hill to argue faith because desire flickers. The librarians aren't interrupted mid-scroll because the body wants pleasure or distraction. Those urges already have a place. They're accounted for, observed, redirected when necessary, ignored when harmless. They don't need escalation unless they start driving the wheel. That's the part people miss when they imagine the Crimson Courtyard as constant chaos. They picture endless noise, constant conflict, a mind at war with itself every second. But that's not how it works. If it did, the system would collapse under its own weight. Most of the time, the court is idle, occupied but calm, roles drifting in and out, minor factions handling minor matters, habits, impulses, routine cognition, bodily urges, all operating without escalation. The full assembly only gathers when something matters, when there's threat, when there's meaning, when there's risk, when there's potential for damage, internal or external. That's when the benches fill. That's when voices raise. That's when scars are presented as evidence instead of sensation. And even then, not everyone shows up. Some voices are situational. Some are seasonal. Some only speak when very specific conditions are met. Lust doesn't weigh in on grief. Greed doesn't argue about safety. Vanity doesn't interrupt survival. Faith doesn't debate biology. Strategy doesn't micromanage appetite. Each impulse has its lane. That's the difference between a fractured mind and an engineered one. This isn't chaos pretending to be order. It's order designed to survive chaos. The Crimson Courtyard isn't there to dramatize existence. It's there so Danny doesn't have to think about staying alive. So that when something finally does demand attention, when a person, a choice, a threat, or a crossroads appears, the system is rested, intact, and ready, not screaming constantly, just waiting. And then there is the presence everyone feels, even when he doesn't speak. The king is here, but not in the way most people expect. He isn't pacing. He isn't shouting. He isn't issuing orders from the benches or dominating the floor. In fact, most of the time, he isn't visibly doing anything at all. Because the king does not exist to argue. He exists to hold shape. The Crimson Courtyard isn't a democracy in the human sense. It's a governance system, yes, but it still requires a final axis, a stabilizing force, a point of reference that prevents the room from collapsing into endless debate. That's the king's role, not to decide what is right, but to decide when a decision is allowed to land. He doesn't care who made the most noise. He doesn't care which faction felt strongest in the moment. He watches for coherence, for alignment, for whether the verdict that's forming will actually hold once it leaves the room and enters the world. When the benches argue themselves into exhaustion, when the evidence has been dragged out, cross-examined, contradicted, reframed, the king doesn't need to speak loudly. Sometimes he doesn't speak at all. Sometimes his presence alone ends the argument, because everyone in that courtyard knows the same thing, even if they resent it. If a decision cannot survive the king, it will not survive reality. This is why the king doesn't micromanage hunger, lust, vanity, routine. Those things don't threaten the structure. They don't destabilize the system. They don't require authority. The king only becomes relevant when identity, boundary, or direction is at stake. When the question isn't what do we feel, but who are we becoming if we act on this? And crucially, the king does not rule alone. He is constrained by the system just as much as he anchors it. If he tries to override the court without consensus, the room revolts. Debate explodes. Noise multiplies. Nothing moves forward. Danny stalls, loops, burns energy without resolution. That's not weakness, that's a safeguard. Because the king was never meant to be a tyrant. He exists so that when the verdict finally comes, when Danny steps back into the external world and acts, it doesn't shatter him afterward. The king ensures that decisions don't just feel powerful, they hold. And that's all that needs to be said about him here. For now, because the Crimson Courtyard isn't where the king lives, it's where he listens. Sometimes there isn't a verdict to reach. No invasion, no argument, no external pressure forcing the system to mobilize. And in those moments, the Crimson Courtyard empties. The benches clear, the shouting dies down, the factions disperse back into whatever corners of the fortress they belong to. No war council, no prosecution, no defense, just the echo of a vast room that has done its job and gone quiet again. And that's when Danny comes here on purpose. He'll sit in that crimson courtroom with past versions of himself, not as memories, but as contained states. These aren't ghosts wandering aimlessly. They are roles that once carried the winning emotion, the one that mattered, the one that survived. Because every major decision, every defining moment, leaves behind a dominant emotional configuration. And those configurations don't dissolve, they stay intact. Sometimes when a decision has already been made, or when something unresolved keeps circling, the system does something precise and unsettling. It assembles a person, not metaphorically, functionally. A collection of emotions, instincts, memories, reactions, and beliefs will consolidate into a single version of Danny, one that represents a specific state. If it's anger, then everything that feeds anger is there with it. Rage, resentment, pride, humiliation, vigilance, defiance. Not scattered across the benches, contained. One posture, one voice, one presence. If it's sadness, then grief, loss, nostalgia, longing, regret, vulnerability, all folded into a single figure that can sit across from him. If it's joy or vitality, then hope, enthusiasm, confidence, creativity, optimism, curiosity, all held together, coherent enough to speak as one. And sometimes the room is almost empty. Just Danny, and one other version of Danny. No shouting, no debate, no crowd, just a conversation. This is where reflection actually happens, because arguing with 100 voices is noise. Sitting with a unified emotional state is understanding. He'll talk to it, ask it questions, let it speak uninterrupted. Let it say the things it couldn't say when it was fragmented across the room. Let it explain why it reacted the way it did, what it wanted, what it was protecting, what it was afraid of losing. And this isn't indulgence, it's interrogation, because Danny isn't just listening as himself. This is where the judge comes in. The judge isn't another emotion. He isn't a role. He isn't a faction. The judge is Danny as awareness, the one who has seen the external events unfold, the one who has felt the internal reactions rise, the one who knows what actually happened out there and what happened in here. The judge sees both sides of reality at once. That's why his ruling is final, because emotions only know their angle. Instincts only know survival. Past selves only know the lesson they learned when they were formed. But the judge knows context. He knows whether anger was justified or just loud, whether sadness is asking for care or avoidance, whether joy is grounded or reckless, whether fear is warning or paranoia. So when Danny sits there across from anger or sadness or joy, he isn't asking permission, he's asking clarity. And once that conversation is finished, once the judge has heard what needed to be heard, the system locks it in. No relitigation, no reopening the case. That's the final decision, not because the loudest voice won, but because the one voice that can see both worlds made the call. And that's why when Danny moves forward after this, calmly, decisively, sometimes without explanation, it's already done. The court has spoken, the roles have been heard, the emotion has been understood, and the judge has ruled. And then there is one more presence. Not a faction, not a role, not an emotion that shouts for its turn to speak. There is a chair in the Crimson Courtyard that was never assigned by vote, never earned through conflict, never seized by force. It is simply there. This is where the lunar ghost sits. Her presence in the court is more like it is necessary, because her opinion is not optional. It is not advisory. It is not comforting background noise. It matters in a way nothing else in the room does. She sits with Danny, and at the same time, impossibly, she sits above him. Not in dominance, not in control, but in balance. Because this is the paradox at the center of it all. She rules with him and she rules over him while still being ruled by him. Inside this internal architecture, that makes sense. Because what this space is really saying is this: if Danny were ever to find a true soulmate in the external world, she would be someone who could sit in this room, in this exact place, and not flinch. She would hear every version of him speak: the rage, the fear, the pride, the grief, the vanity, the hunger, the lust, the doubt, the confidence, the brilliance, the ugliness. And she would not judge them as wrong, but she would still be one of the strongest judges in the room, not by arguing, not by overruling, not by demanding change, but by recognition, by understanding what each voice is protecting, what each one fears losing, and which ones deserve authority and which ones don't. That's why her seat exists here. Because for this system to ever allow someone that close, their presence has to align with the judge, not override him, not soften him, not dismantle him, but resonate with him. And this is where the echo comes in. The echo does not speak in the Crimson Courtyard. It doesn't shout. It doesn't argue. It doesn't circle the room like the other voices. Instead, it stays contained. It hums, low, steady, almost imperceptible. It orbits the lunar ghost, not announcing itself, not demanding attention, just letting the entire court know she is there. The echo doesn't add opinions. It doesn't need to. Its job is simpler and far more ruthless. It listens, it mirrors, it measures. It exists as a silent confirmation that her reasoning, her tolerance, her instincts, her thresholds match his. Same war cries, same lines that should never be crossed. Same understanding of when to fight, when to walk away, and when to stand still and endure. That's why it doesn't need to speak yet, because the moment it ever does, the moment it sounds, the court will already know the verdict. And that's the quiet truth at the heart of the Crimson Courtyard. The lunar ghost doesn't come here to change Danny. She comes here because she already understands him. And if she ever speaks, if her echo ever fully resonates through the room, it won't be to argue. It will be to confirm that the ruling was always the same. And of course, the simple presence of the lunar ghost changes everything. She doesn't need to move. She doesn't need to speak. She doesn't need to assert herself. The moment she is there, every single thing in that room is aware of her. Every voice, every instinct, every emotion, every past self, every adaptive weapon, and every quiet counterweight. They feel her attention the way a room feels a shift in gravity. They know they are being seen, not scrutinized, not threatened, but considered. And that awareness alters how they behave. Not because they are afraid of her, but because her existence introduces something none of them can ignore: impact beyond the self. Her presence forces the court to account for how a decision would land, not just internally, but externally. How it would feel if this were real, if this were shared, if this were someone who mattered standing on the other side of the outcome, if this were a soulmate. So before rage pushes for fire, it hesitates. Before fear demands retreat, it recalculates. Before pride swells too far, it checks itself. Before detachment suggests cutting ties, it weighs the cost. Before logic finalizes its cold conclusion, it asks one more question. How would this feel to her? How would she carry this decision? Would this harm her, or would it protect her? That's why she doesn't need a voice in the courtroom, because she has already been factored in. Her opinion exists implicitly, embedded into the deliberation itself. Her feelings matter by default. Her perspective reshapes the argument without ever interrupting it. And that's the standard. That's the bar. If someone were ever to exist on the external who could truly sit in that chair, their presence alone would change the math. Not by demanding compromise, not by silencing the dragon, but by being important enough that the system adapts around them. But it doesn't stop there, because the Crimson Courtyard is not where these things live. It's where they are called. The courtroom gives every voice a role, a function, a moment to be heard. But once the verdict is delivered, each of them returns to where they belong, deeper in the fortress, into the battlefields, into the maze, into the tavern, into the library, into the tower, into the gardens, into the dungeons. Court doesn't house them, it coordinates them, and the lunar ghost doesn't rule the room by force. She rules it by meaning, by being the one presence that reminds the entire system that survival alone is not the goal. Connection is. And if a decision cannot survive her gaze, then it was never the right one to begin with. And there are times when Danny just does not care. He doesn't care, and when he says that out loud, it lands badly. It sounds dismissive, cold, rude, like indifference bordering on contempt. It upsets people, it hurts feelings, it feels personal. But what he's actually trying to articulate is something far less dramatic and far more literal. There is no mind space for it. The Crimson Courtyard does not convene for everything. It can't. It was never built to. If it did, the system would collapse under the sheer weight of noise. Outside problems, mundane preferences, decisions that don't matter, conversations that don't lead anywhere, situations where there is no risk, no consequence, no meaningful outcome. So those things are screened. Sometimes a case is called to order and no one shows up. No fear, no rage, no logic, no empathy, no curiosity, no strategy. Nothing takes a seat. No faction claims jurisdiction. No voice feels compelled to argue. The benches stay empty, not out of apathy, but out of irrelevance. And when that happens, there is no deliberation to be had. There is no verdict. There is no opinion. So when Danny says, "I don't care," what he means is, there is no internal motion here. No stake, no consequence, no decision required. It's not that he's refusing to think. It's that there is nothing worth thinking about. Not every question needs a court. Not every choice needs a process. Not every preference needs to be owned. What do you want for dinner? What do you think about this? Does this bother you? Sometimes the answer genuinely is, it doesn't matter. Not because he's disengaged from the world, but because the system is conserving itself. Because the court exists to protect clarity, not exhaust it. Because if Danny tried to funnel every external request through that architecture, he would never function at all. So the decision is deferred, or handed off, or left to someone else on the outside to choose. And that, too, is by design. Because the Crimson Courtyard is not there to micromanage life. It is there to intervene only when it matters. Everything else, the voices, the emotions, the instincts, the roles, they don't vanish when the court is quiet. They are simply elsewhere, further in, deeper into the fortress. And that's where we go next.